We've all heard the stories at one point or another, right? How God effortlessly created the heavens and the earth, how he met with the forefathers, maintained this somewhat ambivalent relationship with their descendants as he guided them for 40 years through the desert. And of course, God is probably most well known for the slew of mitzvot, the commandments, which he presented to the Jewish people at the foot of Mount Sinai. These stories all add up to something, but what is that? How does God make himself known through the narrative of the Torah to the Jewish people? And what can we learn from all of this, which can benefit our lives in a real and substantial way? I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. Welcome back to the show. This episode is sponsored by Concepta Solutions. If you or someone you know is having trouble conceiving, the first thing to know is that you're not alone. About 1 in 8 couples are affected with infertility in the United States. Concepta Solutions is a US-based supplements company which provides natural solutions for a variety of fertility-related issues. And today, you can save 10% on your order by visiting conceptasolutions.com and using the code CDSHOW10. They offer both men's and women's fertility supplements. They've got loads of happy customers. And if you or someone that you know is struggling with fertility issues, you can join those happy customers today by visiting conceptasolutions.com and using the code CDSHOW10 for 10% off your first order. That's conceptasolutions.com using the code CDSHOW10 for 10% off your first order. So, before we just jump back into the content, I just wanted to once again express my incredibly profound appreciation of the incredible love and support that we've received over the past week or so. It's just amazingly heartwarming for me to see the tremendous outpouring of positivity and support from all the viewers around the world. So thank you so much for all of that support. It really makes a tremendous difference. So in the previous episode, we began exploring what we mean when we talk about God. And we discovered that the word God, or Hashem as he's often referred to, is a stand-in for first being, that primal force of existence which was before all things and which provides the possibility of existing to all things. And we talked about some of the ways in which knowing about God through that lens can translate into a deeper experience, something more authentic about the way we perceive our life as an expression of that first being. We've also mentioned that the Torah never formally introduces us to God. He's sort of just there in the story, another character playing a part, which, when you think about it, is a pretty astonishing thing. I mean, we'd almost expect that there would be some kind of, specific identification of who God is. Maybe somewhere in the book, some great Jewish leader making this profound speech about God, the creator of the world, the source of being, the sustainer of all of life, whatever it would say about him. But something. Instead, we're just dropped into this dynamic narrative and expected to sort of just learn about the characters as we learn and study the text. So today, we're going to take a look at how the Torah presents God and the way in which Torah asks of us to not only learn about God through the narratives, but also to apply those lessons that we learn to our own lives by emulating God, reflecting what we know of him in the ways we lead our lives and shape our character. According to Jewish tradition, there's actually a mitzvah, one of the 613 commandments, to emulate God in our lives. But in order to emulate him, we've got to get to know him first. So the question becomes, how do we get to know him? Let's unpack this a little bit. So there's a section of verses in the Torah known as the Tochacha, or the rebuke. It's actually pretty heavy reading, where God outlines the consequences of a national breach in the covenant with God. But it also describes the ideal society which we can achieve when we live truthfully and passionately with the covenant as our compass. And one of the verses there draws a ton of attention from the scholars across our tradition and becomes the basis for a mitzvah which transforms every part of the ways that we live our lives. After describing how God will shower Israel with tremendous blessings in all of their undertakings when they stay true to the covenant, the verse continues to say as follows, Yekimcha Adonai lo le'am kadosh. God will establish you as a sacred nation, a treasured people, kasher nishba lach, just as he swore to you that he would do. And when will he maintain this status for you? Ki tishmor et mitzvot Adonai Elohecha, when you caringly keep his commandments, when you safeguard his word, when you stay away from violating that which he has asked of you, vehalachta bidrachav, and when you walk in his ways. If you can do this, then the limitless bounty of God's grace is yours for the taking. And this phrase of v'halachta bidrachav, walking in God's ways, becomes a recurring theme in the book of Deuteronomy, in Devarim. In chapter 13, we have acharei Hashem Elokechem telechu, that we should walk following God. In chapter 11, we find lelechet b'chol derachav, that we should walk in God's ways. And so 2,000 years of rabbinic scholarship all jump up in arms at the turn of these words. What does it mean to walk in God's ways? Wouldn't the observance of the commandments of the Torah themselves constitute walking in God's ways? I mean, what could possibly be added by the inclusion of these words of v'halachta bidrachav? So the Talmud in Tractate Sota and virtually all the medieval authorities explain that these words constitute a legal responsibility, one of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah, and that is to make our path in life reflective of the way God travels through life, so to speak, to conduct ourselves in the ways that God makes himself known as conducting himself within the world, and to become people who embody and reflect the virtues and values that the Almighty himself represents within his Torah. In short, this mitzvah challenges us to align both our psychology and our emotions, to completely redefine the way in which we instinctively respond, and to elevate our every thought and emotion and action into expressing those ways that God manifests through his interactions and teachings found within the Torah. Now, I find this amazing, that there's no independent concept of acting like an upstanding citizen or being a mensch right within the Torah. The whole Jewish concept of character development, of improving one's midot, is entirely drawn from the idea that God himself represents these qualities to us. It's only to the extent that God makes himself known to us through certain particular characteristics that we can see those characteristics as being positive or praiseworthy at all. So it's in the attempt to become godly ourselves, to be in sync with our Creator to whatever extent possible, to walk his ways, that the entire concept of developing a wholesome personality comes into being within Torah. Now, it's important to clarify that when we say God makes himself known to us through these virtues or modes of conduct, we're not saying that God is any of these virtues or has any of them. Those are different statements. As we talked about in the previous episode, we can't speak of God as possessing any given qualities because God's existence precludes limitation of any kind and can't be compartmentalized into these sort of isolated virtues. This can be a little bit confusing since most of us think that if God is infinite, then he must include all things, certainly good things, and that everything is a part of him in some way. And that's really a subject unto itself, something which maybe we can actually address in a different episode. Drop me a note in the comments below if that's something you'd be interested in learning more about. But for our purposes, suffice it to say that when the Torah speaks of God as compassionate or loving or vengeful or angry or patient or anything else, we're speaking about how we, the recipients, perceive God's response to us, which is actually all we can ever say about any other person either. We don't have access to knowing firsthand what is going on in the heart of another person. We can know of another person only that which we perceive of them, their expressions, their output in this world. That can be in their writings, it could be their mood, their smile, or just the raw beauty that they express as a human being. To use a crude example, a person who looks angry might just be putting on a show. Someone with really great composure might just be skilled at concealing their feelings. We know another person through what they express of themselves. And so in a similar way, this is true of God. We know of him what he expresses to us. But when it comes to God, we're actually called upon by the Torah to go one step further, to relate to the Almighty by means of his works and actions, and then also to emulate those things in our own lives. And this becomes one of the mitzvot themselves, the mitzvah of walking in God's ways. V'halachta bidrachav. So the Rambam, Maimonides, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, codifies this mitzvah of learning about God through the Torah and emulating his actions in a special section of his work, the Mishneh Torah, dedicated to the subject of character and interpersonal relationships, called Hilchot Deot. And he explains there that in every way God is referred to in the Torah, whether it's compassionate, sacred, giving, patient, just, courageous, incorruptible, in all of these ways we are obligated to find that equilibrium, that balance within our own lives, and model our character after those virtues. So, with those short few words of V'halachta bidrachav, the entire way which members of Israel are meant to conduct our lives changes forever. And this is one of the things that's really uniquely amazing about Judaism, that we really do take textual analysis very seriously. I mean, as far back as we can trace in our historical record, right, upwards of 2,000 years, we can read the works of thousands of scholars who plumbed the nuances of language in the Torah to discover the meaning behind each and every letter. The Talmud even records that the great Rabbi Akiva of the Second Temple period would deduce piles of practical lessons from the little decorative crowns that you can find on some of the letters in the Torah scroll. And what's amazing to me about that is that there's no other nation in the world who has paid as much attention, no other book which has received as much critical inspection as the Jews have done towards the Torah. And what's probably even more astounding about that is that with all those years of effort and research, of digging deeper into the text, the Torah consistently retains its freshness and relevancy in a way which is essentially supernatural. Until today, you can find the most beautiful insights being discovered within those timeless words of the Torah's text, which are constantly being mined for new meaning. So we're meant to mine the text for meaning and insight. And that's also how we're meant to uncover the personalities of the individual characters within the Torah. You can learn plenty from a cursory reading of the stories, of course, but spend some quality time really immersing yourself into the details, and you can discover tremendous ideas hiding behind every word. And this is one of the ways in which hindsight is 20/20 for us. We live in a time in history where we can look back at 2,000 years of the greatest minds' contributions to this search. We can read their interpretations of the text. We can follow their trains of thought and examine the conclusions that they arrived at. The commentaries can become our tour guides to the text. And as we learn to climb up onto their shoulders and to see the Torah and the world from that elevated point of view, then perhaps we can actually merit to see further than any generation has seen before by using them as the springboard to discovering even greater heights. So if we're going to look to understand God from within the Torah, we can't expect to find his resume neatly presented on page 1, right? We need to carefully trace the movements of God throughout the story, his drachim, and find those instances where a corner of a gem is poking out above the surface. Then carefully excavate those words to extract an entire jewel from the landscape. Now, of course, what's also true and really important to remind ourselves is that the Torah as a whole is the covenantal constitution between God and Israel. And as a result of that, everything in the Torah teaches us in some way or another how we're meant to relate with God, since everything in the Torah tells us how he asks us to think, feel, or act in relation to him in that covenant. For our purposes, what we're really limiting ourselves to here are some of the broader strokes in the Torah, which are more explicit about who God is and how we're meant to relate to him outright. We can then spend the rest of our lives together unpacking all the other details and in every last verse of the Torah. So the first thing we notice about God in the Torah is that he participates with his creation. From the beginning of Genesis, there's this very deliberate involvement that God has with making sure every detail of life comes to fruition in a precise way. And he makes sure to check the final product at the end of each phase of creation to make sure that it did. When mankind descends into moral stagnation in the era of Noach, God executes a hard reset on life rather than letting Earth's inhabitants run themselves into ruin. Not much later, when the residents of Bavel attempt to build this unified city with a central tower reaching towards the heavens, halting the spread of civilization beyond their reach, God intervenes and redirects history towards a more diversified future. And then, of course, there's the beloved Abraham. God appears to Abraham and sets him off on a journey which will alter the course of history forever. He forges a covenant with Abraham, promising him a nation of offspring, and that those children will receive the land of Israel as an inheritance, a Yerusha, as they continue embracing that covenant with full heart and full soul. The relationship continues with Abraham's son, Isaac, Yitzchak, and his grandson, Jacob, Yaakov, and ultimately grows to include a nation of descendants who all cling dearly to the covenant of their fathers before them. And when it comes time for God to free those descendants from the Egyptian bondage, God hears their cries of anguish and punishes the Egyptians for their cruelty. And finally, at the foot of Mount Sinai, the nation stands as one as they enter into this eternal covenant with God, grounded in a loving relationship and a commitment to generations of faithfulness. So that part is so far so good, but here's where God's role appears to take a turn. Suddenly, here come the commandments, right? They arrive in droves. Mountains of minutia become the meat and potatoes of Jewish life. Every last human experience shifts into the governance of Torah's national law for Israel. We become this nation mobilized towards meaning, with our sights set on creating a place on earth for the divine presence to manifest itself within our midst. And then there's this responsiveness. So throughout the 40 years in the desert, we're watching the nation of Israel travel, and the people deal with all sorts of trials and difficulties. And God is always on call, replying to the needs and the choices of the people. Sometimes it's with parental firmness, other times it's with this loving encouragement, but He's there. So I think there are a number of overarching things that we can really begin understanding about God through His role in the Torah, which can help us get reoriented in our relationship with Him. The first is, as I mentioned, that God participates in creation. He's invested in creation. His desire is that creation should work, should continue developing and progressing forward. He has a vision for where it should go, and when things begin to devolve, He's quick to step in and redirect our progress forward. But another aspect of this is that God is patient. He lets things take time. He knows that results aren't achieved overnight, and He understands who He's working with. And this is the element of rachmanut, mercy and compassion, which is used to describe God's actions throughout the Torah. The word rachamim, mercy, shares a common root letters, the resh, chet, mem, with the word for a mother's womb, the place for a child to develop at its own pace with all the nutrition needed at each stage of its development. God's compassion, His rachmanut, is no different. It's the provision of space for His creation to develop at its own pace. Rather than creating a world of black and white, of truth and false, a world in which a transgression would immediately result in being purged from the world, being struck down by lightning, God gives us space to discover our own way, always gently pointing us towards the road back home when we're prepared to return. So there's this balance between the way in which God leads and conducts creation with the autonomy that He allows for individuals and society as a whole to find their own way at their own pace. This isn't some minuscule project to Him or something which He has to do to create a world so as, to fulfill His role as a creator before stepping back and moving on to other things. He's present and He participates in the highs and lows of life. He wants us to relate to Him as rejoicing when we succeed and as being crestfallen when we stumble. The way Tehillim, the book of Psalms, expresses this is Imo Anochi Batzara, that I'm with you in times of distress, says God. I feel your pain. I'm right beside you. And when you think about this can really open up a really amazing realization. We usually think about God as having created the world so very long ago, however many years ago it was, and that the world we live in today is almost an absolute, some permanent fixture which was brought into being in our distant past. But what's crucial to realize is that when God created the world, He wasn't just creating space, He was creating time-space. God doesn't create at a particular point in time. He created time itself. And as such, He's doing His creating outside of time. Now, this can be a bit of a confusing point, since we're obviously time-bound creatures, and we really can't conceive of what it means to exist beyond the limitations of time. We do know that some realities exist beyond the limits of time, right? All of mathematics, for example. So time itself, being something which exists, draws its existence from God. So in the same way that we are created, the very fabric of time-space is also created. Now, this realization changes our entire discourse about God's involvement with our lives, because we realize that rather than creating the universe at some distant point in time, God is always in a state of creating the universe. At this very moment in time, God is just as much involved in the creating of the universe as He is during the earliest stages of life on earth. And as Jews recite in the first blessing before we recite the Shema prayer every day, God is mechadesh betuvo bechol yom tamid maaseh breshit. God renews all of creation each and every day. And so that classic question of why did God create the world shifts into why is God creating the world? Which, of course, is a subject for another time, but it changes the question into something where the answer speaks to me personally here right now, rather than to some distant point in our past. So, shifting back to our analysis of how God conducts himself in the Torah, another beautiful expression of how God shares himself is this balanced attention between the grand and the often overlooked. And this is something which the Talmud in Tractate Megillah speaks about, that whenever we find God's greatness being recorded in the Torah, we immediately find his humility, his unpretentiousness as well. So we'll find that in one verse we're hearing that God is great, mighty, and awesome. And in the very next verse, we'll learn that he tends to the needs of the orphan and the widow. This is striking, of course, because gods are usually portrayed in classic religious literatures as being busy tending to the larger needs of the universe at large, right? Focusing on the grand scheme of things while letting the minutiae kind of get sorted out on their own. But the way God of Torah is presented is precisely the opposite. God is involved in tending to the needs of the downtrodden, precisely to the extent that he maintains the fundamental forces of nature. So the question for us becomes, are there aspects in our lives or in our relationship with Torah that we think of as below us in some way, or perhaps too insignificant to deserve our attention? If we're going to walk along God's paths, then our care for life and for our Judaism should be sensitive to the overlooked, to the taken advantage of, and to those little details, the elements of life which are often overlooked and undermined by all those who are usually too busy focusing on the more important things in life to take care of the small individual details. So I'd like to share just one last way of how God is expressed in the Torah, and it's actually a term used to describe God himself, and that is that the Torah refers to God as an El Kana, vengeful or impassioned God. And what this means is that he takes his relationships very seriously. He takes the dignity of the other seriously, and he treats commitment with the utmost respect. So let's unpack this idea a little bit, because I think it's evident that that could teach us some really significant ways about the way we live our lives. There are really two sides to this zealous behavior, this kanaut, that God expresses. The first is that God wants us to know of him, that he expects faithfulness from those he partners with. And this is always the way the Torah presents its aversion to idolatry, to avodah zarah. Don't worship idols because God is vengeful. He sees this relationship between God and Israel as an exclusive one, and he expects us to feel the same way. He wants us to relate to the performance of mitzvot, or in the inverse, the violation of avirot, as affecting the personal relationship that we have between us and him. And that when a person commits the ultimate treason of foreign worship, of turning to some other perceived power in the world in mind and heart, he wants us to know that that is absolutely destructive to the relationship. And what this means for us is that if we're going to be like God, it means to keep our word. It's to put our relationships first. It's to know that when something or someone is special, we have to treat it with the respect it deserves. But the second aspect of this kanaut, this zealousness of God, is even more powerful. For God to self-define as zealous means that he binds himself, so to speak, to the covenant that he has with Israel. And this is something which is actually articulated in the Torah, in the 7th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, that God is an ha'el ha'ne'eman, shomer habrit v'achesed. He's a faithful God, a God who exhibits integrity, who safeguards his side of the covenant and the love between him and those who love him, which is really an astounding thing when you think about it. I mean, here we are, right? A bunch of nomadic bipeds wandering around on this little rock, flying through some quiet corner of the universe. And God, that first being, has given himself over to us and tied his own hands behind his back, so to speak, in limiting his actions to the set of possibilities listed within our covenant. And God restates this commitment to Israel in some of the most moving verses in the Torah, both in the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, and towards the beginning of Devarim, where after listing all the ways in which the nation of Israel might drift away from God and weaken our own resolve and our faithfulness to him, God states that he will never break the promises that he has made to our people. And he says the most beautiful thing. He says, Va'af gam zot biyotam be'eretz oivehem. Even though all of these heartbreaking changes where Israel will undergo the most horrific challenges because of our loosened resolve and integrity in our relationship with God, God says, Lo ma'astim velo ga'altim l'chalotam, lahafer briti itam. I will never become disgusted by you. I will never spurn you, to wipe you out, or to annul my covenant with you. I could never do that to you. Ki ani Adonai Elohehem, because I am God, the source of being, and I am yours. I made a promise to you and your forefathers before you, and I will protect that promise to the very end. And no matter how far Israel slips away across the vicissitudes of time, I will be here keeping my side of the covenant until that awaited moment where we can fulfill our commitments to each other once again. And this is exactly what God tells the nation in Deuteronomy, in the final words of Moshe speaking. Batsar lecha umtsaucha, kol advarim ha'ele ba'acharit hayamim, that after everything has been said and done, when Israel has been spread across the face of earth, when you're going through the most difficult times, and when all of these foretold calamities have befallen you at the end of days, Vishavta ad Adonai Elohecha, vishamata bekolo. You will then return to God and truly listen to his voice. Finally, Ki el rachum Adonai Elohecha, lo yarpecha v'lo yashchitecha. For God is compassionate and patient. His resolve never weakened to hold you and support you. V'lo yishkach et brit avotecha asher nishba lahem. And he will never forget the eternal covenant forged with your ancestors, which he swore upon, giving himself over to a future which would only come to fruition after thousands of years of struggle and tribulation. What we've discovered is a God who loves life immeasurably, a God who is patient with his creation, recognizing its shortcomings and allowing for the independence necessary to achieve the developments of her journey at the pace appropriate for her. The God of Torah is involved and invested in his creation. He's not absent at her triumphs or vindictive during her failures, but rather wants us to see him as accompanying our journey supportively each step of the way. Yes, it's true, he's a vengeful God. Details matter a tremendous amount to him. A universe is no more or less significant to him than a single human life. What does create the significance is the degree to which an entity has reached out in love and commitment towards the Almighty, drawing him in with truth and integrity and building a relationship, something that he can invest in, something that he can trust. Now, there's so much more to discover about God and ourselves through the narratives of the Torah, but hopefully this serves as somewhat of a first step, an opening to engaging with God in the way that he means to be known to us. And hopefully this can open ourselves up to working on the aspects within our own character that build us into truly great people. People who are not only pleasant and nice, but also reflective of those godly characteristics which are made known to us through the narratives of our beautiful Torah. I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. See you all next time. I hope you enjoyed that segment of the Chaim Davies Show. If you did, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, or follow our podcast so you can stay up to date on all our future content.